Kent, you gonna go?
Sure. So, well, since Vlad, you probably missed a couple stand-ups. I just thought I would um, go through some things that might be useful, or like some, I don't know, how should I call them, what I've learned as I implemented kind of thing. So one thing is, you know how at one point we were discussing how if you have a fork choice, you don't have to do it from the Genesis because you can do it from the last finalized block.
Yeah, or even later, really.
Yeah, and so uh, I just so basically we discovered that you can't do it from the last finalized block. Like you have to do it from what we define as the lowest common ancestor,
Yeah,
and
well, I mean, so that's more efficient. Yeah, the last finalized block is like further back than that.
No,
not necessarily. Yeah, that's the
no.
thing that caught us.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, like I mean, I don't know.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
but
Mhm.
can you explain what you mean? So I mean, so in my opinion, okay, you're right. So never mind. I don't know which one's later, but you take whichever one is for or has like a higher block height and start from there.
Well, you can just take the lowest common ancestor, and that's it.
Yeah,
Like,
no, that's not necessarily good, right? If depending, like, I mean, you don't want to be like orphaning a finalized block, like that's not really acceptable.
it's not that you're orphaning the finalized block. You will never orphan finalized block, but you might have to score further back just so that
Sorry, guys.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
Well, so let me put it this way: if you if you're simply doing a starting from the latest messages, start scoring all the way until the lowest common ancestor, and then doing this fork choice up from the lowest common ancestor back to one of the latest messages kind of implementation, um, you'll need to do this because start if you only score until the last finalized block, then you might end up missing out on secondary parents. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I guess one thing I forgot to say was this only this matters a lot, or this manifests a lot more if you're using I forgot what it's called, multi-parent ghost or um,
Inclusive ghost.
yes, thank you, inclusive ghost. Yep. And so yeah, it manifests a lot more if you're under inclusive ghost. But yeah, that's one thing. And the other thing is for bonding new validators, I guess like you've mentioned before that like we should treat it as a completely new set. It's kind of easier implementation wise to just swap in an extra validator, and the the issue with doing that is like you want to you like at first we were using the main parent, so to speak, or sorry, we were we were saying the latest message of the newly bonded validator was the block that they got bonded in, but this would give us these random justification regression uh, warnings. So we switched it back so that the latest message for a newly bonded validator is just Genesis. And maybe that's an obvious thing to do in retrospect, but yeah, that's another thing that we got caught up on. But yeah, besides that, there hasn't been anything, at least on the Casper side, that was a huge gotcha for implementation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that changing the validator set slowly works, but I think that you have to kind of basically give a new definition of the fork choice rule that is in terms of this changing validator set. Like, whereas if you change the entire validator set discretely, you can use the exact same fork choice rule definition. And it's like a minor inconvenience, but at the end of the day, it may totally be worth it. It's just like now you don't have exactly ghost, you have like ghost with the changing validator set, as opposed to when you do the discrete validator changes, just a whole bunch of different applications of ghost with different validator sets.
So when you say like different fork choices, do you mean like the way we do the scoring currently is we look up the parent block and then we fetch the bonds and we use the weight in the bonds to add to what we call like a score map. And so like it sort of automatically, or how should I say, like, yeah, because and then we just keep traversing down the DAG. So
yeah, totally. So it's like, it's like you're changing the validator set at every block potentially.
Yeah, that's basically what it looks like.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, like, I think that's fine, but basically you need to have some notion that, like, some identities are persistent and that they and so basically, like, the let me put it this way: validator names are no longer going to be fixed duration in this model, whereas like in the model that I kind of use normally, I have like fixed duration validator names, and like validators somehow need to get new names for every like epoch.
I see. So under this model, can we not still have fixed length identities? I don't know what you call them exactly, but we just prevent.
Not because like you have like a certain maximum length maybe. I guess you could have fixed length, but they're just not all lined up.
Yeah, or we have like at a higher level, we prevent validators from bonding and unbonding unless they're at certain block heights.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I do think it's going to be like a slightly different specification of the fork choice rule, because like right now the fork choice rule, as I define it anyways, is parametric in the validator set. In this case, yeah, it's like I think you have a pretty reasonable definition, but you're going to have all sorts of latest messages from validators that are going to happen after their last block where they got signed off or like removed from the validator set, and those blocks are not going to get in the chain. So there's like, for every validator that gets signed off, they need to produce a bunch of messages that, sorry, 1 second, go sneeze.
I see. Yeah, I guess one thing we haven't gotten to yet is like we're currently assuming that if you bond as one identity, like you can never bond as the same identity again, if that makes sense. And so like all we have to do is we have to make sure that when we're right before we execute the fork choice rule, we filter the latest messages to equal the justifications of the block we're about to validate. or if we're about to create a block, then we just use everything we've seen so far, because yeah, there's nothing. I guess that would sort of include all the old validators, but at least it hasn't caused us issues as of now. I don't know if that made sense, but
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, and I think at the end of the day, we want the justification just to be like the structure that we can use to most efficiently and easily on like some kind of bandwidth, computer overhead trade-off, verify the consensus values or like the previous block pointers. And also I wanted to mention that, like, you know, maybe we won't include everything that they've heard of in when we have like liveness strategies that involve ignoring messages from validators who are like DOSing, being malicious.
yep, that makes sense. But yeah, that's basically.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
for my
curious
updates.
about the validator set change thing. I gotta look into it a little more. But in this light client spec, we just have like a fixed validator set. It's great.
I see.
So let me kind of go do an overview of the light client spec. Oh wait, Greg, do you have an update?
I do actually. I wanted to do a screen share, but I'm driving right this second. I suppose I can talk people through it.
I could do my update first. Are you driving towards the screen?
No, it'll be a while before I'm there.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't think I can do a screen share. So I think Kent has heard this, but I don't think you have. So it's actually worthwhile to do a little bit of background catch up before I do the development that showed up last week when I was working with Christian Williams. So, you know, I've talked before about the error correcting codes and how they provide the synchrony constraint. Now I can describe exactly how the synchrony constraint happens and why it happens, and then how it gets encoded in the row calculus, and then how there's a variant of the row calculus that gives you an extra level of expressivity. So the core idea with the error correcting codes is that there's this duality between structured data and communication activity that corresponds to building up that structured data from additional communications, right? So if I can only send some atomic thing like a bit or a name in the pi calculus, then if I want to send more structured data, then I have to do more communication. And if I want to send more structured data over potentially lossy channels, right? So where there's dropping of information, duplication of information, and reordering of information, then I have to do even more communications. Now, there's a corresponding thing that I could do with the error. First of all, let me just stop there to make sure that people understand, right? There's this clear duality between sending structured data versus sending atomic data, but more communications. Does that make sense?
Kind of, but how do you, encode the structure?
For example, the way to encode a linked list is given in the polyadic pi calculus tutorial, right? So it's a very clear indication of a way I would encode that data structure, and that corresponds in a step-by-step fashion to a series of communications. So, but it's not required that we have a fixed encoding. All that's required is to recognize that for any structured data, there's a corresponding set of communications to communicate that structure. Is that clear?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, cool.
I mean,
all right. So
I don't know why you can't just communicate the structured data directly, though.
No, you can communicate the structured data directly, but my point is that there's a duality between communicating the structured data directly and doing extra communications. That the two are interconvertible. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay, cool. That's the important thing. Now, and then if we add this additional factor of lossy channels, so noisy channels where messages can be dropped, duplicated, or reordered, then there's even additional communications on top of that. So now it turns out that there's a duality. In addition to that, there's a duality between the encodings that you might give in defense of loss for atomic data and the sending of structured data in such a way that you can account for noise in the channel. So this includes duplication of data and permutations of data to address loss and reordering. And now an error. So under those interpretations, the error correcting code becomes a limit on the amount of extra communication you can have across that. So if you just convert the error correcting code into its corresponding communication structure, it provides a limit on how much extra communication you can have. That's what it's doing. That's why it essentially provides a synchrony constraint. It's a way of specifying how much additional communication you can have to communicate structured data in the face of noise. So that's why it works as a synchrony constraint. It's literally limiting communication.
Is it to just give you like a best case overhead or something like that? What does it give you?
Yeah, that's right. And so now, so then the next piece of the puzzle is how would you go about representing that in a row calculus-like setting? And that next piece of the puzzle is that the whole COM rule variation where you can you associate a context to the COM rule does the trick. So you can, so I don't know if you've seen this before, Vlad, but you can replace the COM rule where you have a for y from xp running in parallel with send q on x goes to p, in which you've substituted the quote of q for y. And you change that to, for each context k, you get a COM rule COM sub k, in which you, instead of substituting the quote of q for y, you substitute the quote of k applied to q for y. And now, the nice thing is that context can represent either the encoder-decoder pairs for the error correcting code, or it represents the additional communication that is does what the encoder-decoder pairs do in terms of back and forth to send this structured data in a noisy situation. So that context represents that extra level of communication that's either taking the payload and decoding it, sort of encoding it on the way in, decoding it on the way out for the error correcting code, or dually the little kabuki dance that one would do to send the structured data in a setting where you only can send atomic data. So now we have this nice crisp way to represent that in the row calculus. And then the next step is that there's a variant. So, but the restriction there is that it's a fixed encoder-decoder pair for all communication, which restricts your expressivity. If you'd like to be able to change the encoder-decoder pair over time, then you'd like to be able to change that context. And that's exactly what the space calculus gives. So the space calculus has builds off of the idea of the catalyst that we used in our 2015 paper to account for or restrict the unwanted reductions under a prefix in the categorical model, right? So what we say is, well, you don't get to reduce unless you have this special catalyst. And that actually represents lots and lots of different things. For example, gas could be a special catalyst that is required in order to allow for reduction. In other situations, having actual hardware, like an actual physical thread as opposed to some logical thread which may be blocked or queued up on a in a worker pool. That's a resource that might be necessary in order to enable the COM reduction to go forward. So this idea of catalyst restricted COM events is a natural one that fits the particular setting that we're in. And here, what we do is we just, with the space calculus, we just extend that a little bit, and instead of having the fixed context, which is representing your encoder-decoder pairs, you enrich or refine the notion of the COM catalyst with the context. And likewise, you have a corresponding notion of releasing that catalyst, the context from the catalyst. So there's another operator U, and it releases the COM catalyst. So you always get this contention of either binding the catalyst into a COM rule or releasing the catalyst back into the wild, or back into the soup, as it were. And so that gives us the ability to have not just one static error correcting code that rules over the entire run of the protocol, but to be able to update the error correcting code. So we're not fixed in terms of our expressivity, but we can change the synchrony constraints as the protocol is evolving. So that's the key insight that came from last week while working with Christian Williams. And yeah, I think it's a very powerful framework, because now everything can be written down. We have a theory of bisimulation, and we've sort of tied up how the intuitions correspond to the symbols. Does that make sense?
I mean, kind of. I mean, I'm kind of struggling to relate the error correcting code to the redundancy in the messages, though, in terms of like actually people sending.
So here's a simple way to think about it, right? So in one simple error correcting code, instead of sending a single bit, you triplicate the bit. So you send 3 copies of the bit. And then so when you look at receipt on the other end, if you get 2 zeros, or if you get 3 zeros, you're confident it's a 0. If you get 3 ones, you're confident it's a 1. If you get 2 zeros and a 1, you feel pretty good that it's a 0. And if you get 2 1s and a 0, you feel pretty good that it's a 1. Right? And what it does, you can think about it as reflecting a kind of a voting mechanism. That's another way to think about it, right? When you triplicate the bit and you send it across the wire, whatever you get represents sort of a kind of vote on what the bit is. Each one of the bits that you receive for that particular, 3-bit gadget represents a vote on what each communication event thinks that bit was. So that may help when you're thinking in terms of these validator kinds of protocols. But that's sort of a standard set of intuitions from the literature.
But like if a validator is being faulty, like I don't know if it really that matters if you send them the same message 3 times.
I'm simply saying that I'm not saying that that's an error correcting code that's you would employ in the specific setting. I'm saying that's one simplistic error correcting code that has specific properties in
Sure.
terms of, right? So just to shore up your intuitions. So you can understand what an error correcting code is doing it and why it's doing it. What an error correcting code is doing and why it's doing it. Yeah. So you can do things to message structure which in the presence of noise turns out to avoid the noise. And all the error correcting code is doing is saying it's putting a limit on the amount of extra communication you're allowed to do. And that's why it constitutes a synchrony constraint. That's in the papers that I sent you, the core insight in those papers is that the error correcting codes give you a crisp bound on additional communication in the face of noise. So whenever in other words, whenever you put forward an error correcting code, whatever the code is, it's also expressing this bound on extra communication. And so that's the key idea. And so encoder decoder pairs represent a kind of synchrony constraint. And now you have a language for expressing these synchrony constraints that doesn't limit you to wall clock time. And this is in fact why, and if you run it the other way around, that's why in the quantum case, they're able to get a notion of time emerging from the error correcting codes, because the error correcting codes give you a synchrony constraint. So they're literally, sort of bubbling up a notion of wall clock time that is built off of those synchrony constraints. So that's why it's, it sort of has these broader implications or applications. And then the trick with the space calculus is that you don't have to fix one error correcting code for the entire lifetime of the protocol. You can have an error correcting code which gives you synchrony constraints for some communications, and then you can change the synchrony constraints, but they're all expressed in the same language. So over time, you don't have a fixed bound on the synchrony constraints. You just know that you're always going to be bounded by some synchrony constraints, right? And then you can, if you put additional conventions or other constraints on the context that you supply, then that gives you additional room for reasoning about the protocol. This sort of ties a ribbon on it now, in terms of, now we've got a framework, we can reason about it. We have, the standard proof techniques like bisimulation, and it fits into a typing discipline. So I feel quite pleased about the whole thing.
Sounds satisfying.
Yeah.
I'm still not understanding the encoder decoder synchrony assumption thing, but maybe
Well,
not.
you know, maybe offline you and I can you know walk you through it. It's really very simple. It's just like, you know, an encoder decoder pair just says, you know, we can tolerate this much noise, and the toleration of that noise is equivalent to, or we're putting a bound on the extra communication in the face of noise. That's what it is.
Okay, but how do you go from an erasure encoding to a liveness strategy that tolerates that much noise?
So the liveness strategy is the bound on the extra communication. So what you need for in order to be live, you have to say, I can only, like for example in the Casanova thing, they have to put a bound on the the messages will arrive in some finite time, although they don't say what finite time. Here, what we're saying is we don't have a notion of wall clock time. We just say you're only allowed so many extra messages in these kinds of orders, and you know this, you know, and this much parallelism, right? So the encoder decoder pair gives you a crisp specification of the, you know, the limit of all the extra communication in the face of noise, and that extra communication, that limiting of extra communication is your synchrony constraint. And once you have a synchrony constraint, then you can break FLP. That's the key idea. But what time is it now? So 11 minutes to give your update.
Yeah, sounds good. So I don't know if you guys are watching Christian's screen share here. But basically, I'm going to go through and give a quick overview of this paper that I'm preparing, which gives the light-client specification for CVC Casper, which is kind of a modification of the full node specification to not require that nodes download the dependencies of messages. And it satisfies all of the kind of traditional proofs that the CVC Casper protocol satisfy. Christian, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Just tell me what to do.
Yeah, scroll, please. Can you just scroll? So this is the full node specification. And, you know, it's kind of what you're used to seeing, all relatively inlined. It gives the protocol states with the full node condition, which you can see on line 8, and the validity condition on line 7. On line 9, we see the Byzantine, or sorry, equivocation fault rejection condition. And so this is kind of like the whole protocol specification for the full node protocol, when we're just giving the specification as protocol states. And then we have these theorems that we have in this checklist at the bottom of this page here. Which hopefully we're all familiar with, you know, common features theorem, and then the consistency of decisions. Scroll, please, to the next page. And then here we have the light client specification, which is a little bit different than the other specification. We have Byzantine fault rejection still on line 14 this time. No condition, no full node conditions, or no condition that you have to have the justifications of messages. That was kind of removed from that line. And now we have like a significantly more complicated message validity condition, where the consensus value needs to be in the estimator for some protocol state that's hidden behind hashes. And the message structure for the like client specification has a consensus value and a validator name, and then a list of hashes or a set of hashes. And the claim is kind of that this also satisfies the same theorems. It basically, through the Byzantine fault reduction, have this common future theorem, because if two like lines have two sets of messages which don't together have less than t faults.
You're not actually like your theorem doesn't rely on inspecting the structure of the messages. So if you replace the struct of the messages with a hash, your theorem is going to go through.
More or less, there's like a slight refactoring that needs to happen because of the slight change in the definition of equivocation, where we're checking if the hash is in there instead of if the message is in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You're pushing you've got a functor on this on the category that supports these propositions, and you just applied the functor, which is shifting the everything over in terms of the hashes as opposed to the structure on the messages. Yeah, this part is not surprising. So is there something more?
So basically, we have, and then I kind of go through in quite a lot of detail about all of the parts of the specification. So we kind of look at things. So now looking at the consensus value, look at it without consensus values. It's like removing consensus values.
Oh, I see. Yeah. See, of course.
Just for the full notes. Can we go to the next specification, please? And then for the light client here, we basically have this specification without consensus values, and it looks a little less simple than the full node one because we have this hash validity condition. But if you go to the next specification, where we drop that hash validity condition, we get this protocol, which actually has a pretty relatively nice specification, and also satisfies our kind of key theorems. But weird thing, kind of next protocol also satisfies these theorems.
Can you go to the next one, Christian?
This is just removing the fault count restriction.
That's not good.
No, it's fine. I'm going to explain. So go to the next page, would you? So basically, we're going to talk about like non-triviality and add this to our kind of checklist and see kind of this claim here. Scroll a little bit. This protocol that we just gave has no non-trivially decidable properties of protocol states, which means that when a property, a property is non-trivially decidable if it can be decided to be true or decided to be false. And we can kind of pretty easily show that this protocol here has no non-trivial properties by assuming that it does, and then coming up with a contradiction.
Oof. You don't believe in construction, do you?
Well, I mean, I do. It's just not always the most intuitive way to lay it out, in my opinion. My next
pulling a rabbit out of a hat is more intuitive. Yes.
It's pretty easy. So, if you have a state that's decided true and the other one that's decided false, their common future, their union, which exists in this power set, is going to either satisfy the property or not, and therefore they can't both be decided. And so this is kind of So this protocol has no non-trivially decidable properties. So if we scroll a little bit, we don't have any non-triviality. Oh, the checklist. Yeah, so there's no non-triviality. Because we dropped the consensus values, we don't have the last two items in the checklist. So if you scroll down a little more, I have this proof here that by adding in the false projection, we kind of somehow gain non-trivially decidable properties of the protocol. And like non-triviality is a necessary kind of property for consensus protocols. And so somehow, and this is a constructive proof where I choose, some property of protocol states, which is the fact that that state includes a message M. And I choose the message to be from a particular validator that has a weight that's pivotal with respect to the fault tolerance threshold, and then show that I can construct a protocol state that is decided false on that state, and also one that's decided true. The one that's decided true is really easy. It's just that message. The ones that decided false basically has to contain an equivocation with respect to that message, and be almost at the fault tolerance threshold, so that that validator will potentially or will definitely cause that threshold to be violated. So if you scroll down a little bit, and these are the three requirements for this protocol state. So the sender of this message that we're asking the property of whether we've received it shouldn't be equivocating, but there's a message that's an equivocation with respect to it in there, and that way that validator would push the protocol state over the fault threshold.
Hey, I gotta jump over to a dev stand-up now.
Okay. So long story short, the hash validity condition ends up being required for the way that we check the consensus values.